is really to protect this property for future generations, and frankly, to allow each of us to, frankly, to revel in the beauty that's there now, and not only on the river farm itself, but also the views of the river that are part of that. The timing on this community meeting could not be more perfect. As many of you probably know, state legislation recently approved by the House and Senate will allow the county to further protect the land by permitting the inclusion of provision in our historic preservation ordinance that would allow public access to an historic area, a landmark building or structure, or land pertaining thereto, or providing that no subdivision shall occur within any historic district unless approved by the review board or on appeal by the governing body of the locality, as being compatible with the historic nature of such area, landmark, building, or structure. And that governing body would be ultimately the Board of Supervisors. In addition, the General Assembly has also approved a bill that would provide $2 million to save River Farm. A big thank you for really all of these items goes to our state legislators, particularly Adam Evans, Senator Stovall, and on our representatives. I want to thank particularly Paul Krizak, Mark Sickles, and also David Bola for their work on essentially ensuring that we would be able to protect this property on into the future. I also want to extend my extreme gratitude to Laura Arsenault, Lily Ugazu, Denise Dressel, and the rest of the Heritage Resource staff for their diligence and hard work in putting together this HOD package. I also want to thank EHG Traceries for their work on the HOD draft design guidelines for this property. And finally, the continued work to save River Farm would not be possible without the support of each and every one of you on this call tonight, and each and every one of you who's spent so much time, energy, and effort over the past many, many months. I especially want to thank Alan Rosum. Of course, I want to thank Paul Gilbert for their work on this, and incredible work on this. Also, Catherine Ward, Ann Fafara, and really all the members of the community advocacy group that have helped to, quote unquote, put together the Save River Farm, and the respective organizations that you all represent or have brought into this process. Thank you for your extraordinary support in helping us get there. I look forward to learning from county staff tonight to determine about the historic character of the property. Again, thank you all very much. Enjoy the presentation. I know that I will, and more importantly, I will rest more comfortably once we have this piece in place, along with the additional legislation that Scott, I know, got into the Senate, and now the House has passed and it's on the governor's desk. All of those things will fit together to truly give us some sense of ability to protect this property. I obviously regret the fact that the HS board has rejected the offer by Regional Park Authority and the Virginia Conservation Trust. I'm confident that we will continue to be able to go back to them, and hopefully they'll be able to see that this is truly an offer that they should not refuse, because it is in everybody's long-term interest. So with that, Laura, others, thank you very much for your efforts.
Thank you very much for those words, Supervisor Stork. We do have, and on the note on the staff working on this project, I'd be remiss if we didn't introduce them a little bit ahead of time. So once again, I'm Laura Arsenault, I'm the branch chief project manager, and our Heritage Resource team that's working on this is Nicole Brennan. She's one of our senior Heritage Resource planners. And then also Lily Yegazu, who's with the Zoning Administration Division. She'll be talking a little bit later about the zoning ordinance amendment and the rezoning application. I also have a couple branch chiefs with us from the Department of Planning and Development, including Bill Malin from the Zoning Administration Division, Kathy Lewis from Zoning Evaluation Division, and let me see if anyone else, I think that's it. But we also have Leanna O'Donnell, who's the director of the Planning Division, and Barbara Byron, who's the director of the Department of Planning and Development. So as you can see with this very diverse team, it really is an entire effort from the Department of Planning and Development on this application. So with that, David, if you would go ahead and move to the next slide.
Laura, if people could mute themselves, I'm still getting a lot of background noise. Thank you.
So for everybody that's on the attendees list right now, you've come in muted. And at the end of the presentation tonight, there'll be an opportunity for you all to speak. We will unmute you and you'll be able to answer questions. If you need to communicate with us during the meeting, to the right side of your screen, you should see a Q&A function. Please type any questions that you may have or concerns into that. We have staff monitoring that. If everybody would go ahead and type here or hello or hi, just so we know that that functionality is able to be used, that would be great. Great, thank you very much. I think we have about 60 people on the call now, so thank you very much. There's a lot of interest in this application. And then also another function that we have in this WebEx platform is a raise your hand function. And I think if you on where it says participants, if you click to the right of your name, a little hand will show up, and that's how you can ask a question or be recognized. So you can either type your question into the Q&A function or do the little raise your hand function. I'm sorry, it's at the bottom of your participants list to the bottom right. There's a little hand and you can raise your hand. So if you want to raise your hand, feel free to raise your hand, but you can see kind of it's a virtual hand raising function with WebEx. So those are the two ways that you're able to communicate with staff. At the end, like I said, there'll be ample time for questions. So let's go ahead and get started. David, if you go to the next slide, please. All right, so this is the background. You all know where the property is, located at 7931 East Boulevard Drive and immediately adjacent to the George Washington Memorial Parkway. It's located in Alexandria and in the Mount Vernon Supervisor District. As Supervisor Stork mentioned earlier, hold on one second, I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. You could all please mute all the participants, all the panelists. Okay, great, thank you. So on November 17th, 2020, the Board of Supervisors requested that staff analyze the feasibility of the creation of the River Farm Historic Overlay District. In response to this authorization, staff has developed an analysis report, which is going to be published tomorrow. We're also working on a comprehensive plan amendment, a zoning ordinance amendment, and a rezoning that's mainly administrative to add the proposed boundary to the zoning map. In addition, staff is working with Ehg Traceries as a consultant for draft design guidelines, and they'll be doing a small presentation on the design guidelines later. David, if you go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So a couple of background information and kind of keywords here is, what is a historic overlay district? A historic overlay district is a zoning tool that promotes the general welfare through the identification, preservation, and enhancement of buildings, structures, neighborhoods, and landscapes, places and areas that have historical, cultural, architectural, or archaeological significance. So it's a zoning tool for the county to provide extra regulations on specific properties. What is the Architectural Review Board? The Architectural Review Board, or the ARB as we like to call it, oversees the areas and properties within historic overlay districts. There are 13 historic overlay districts in the county now, and the ARB members are appointed by the Board of Supervisors. The ARB uses the design guidelines, which are an integral part to this effort, to review building permits and site plans to ensure new development within districts are appropriate with historic significance. And the ARB collaborates with the homeowner on the design proposal to ensure it does not negatively impact the historic visual significance of the property. David, if you go ahead for the next slide, please. Once again, what would an HOD mean for this property? An ARB approval would be required before a building permit is issued or site plans can be approved, and applies primarily to larger exterior renovations, construction, or demolition. So any interior alterations that are on the property right now can remain. The existing renovations that are there, even if outside the period of significance, can remain. And the underlying zoning, the R2, remains in place. David, if you go ahead to the next slide. A little bit more on the site information. The site is approximately 27.58 acres and is currently planned for private recreation in zoned R2, which is 2 dwelling units per acre. There's a governing special exception on the property for public benefit administration, and the property is currently owned by the American Horticultural Society, but as Supervisor Stork mentioned, is up for sale. Next slide, please. Here's an aerial map of the property and shows that the site is located among the residential uses and located east of the George Washington Memorial Parkway and is bounded to the north by the Wellington subdivision, which is zoned R2, the Potomac River to the east, and to the south by large residential parcels, also zoned R2. The property is accessed through a long driveway from East Boulevard Drive, and a resource protection area is located on the eastern and northern property line. That's the dotted area overlay on the map. Next slide, please. So staff analysis and findings, that's the bulk of what we're going to present to you tonight. Staff has been busy since November 17th, determining proposed historic overlay district boundaries and contributing and non-contributing, I should say, structures and features, not properties. There's only one property that's being proposed in this application, and it's just the River Farm property boundary as it stands today. As I mentioned earlier, there'll be a comprehensive plan amendment, a zoning ordinance amendment, and a rezoning to the overlay district. Next slide, please, David. So the site significance. There's two parts to the site significance. As you all are probably well aware, the property was one part of George Washington's River Farm land holdings. Today, the 27 acres is a much smaller part of that, but it still is part of the original land holdings. Washington gave a life estate to the property to Tobias Lear, his personal secretary, and Lear lived on the property until his death in 1816. Due to the modification of the building to when Malcolm Matheson owned the property, staff has determined that the period of significance is when the Matheson family lived on the property from 1919 to 1973. We determined that the built environment and what stands today would lead to the significance of the property. So Malcolm Matheson bought the property, changed it to the colonial revival style that you see today, including the symmetrical facades, the rectangular roof plans, and the double hung windows, the accentuated front door that is iconic, and a pedimented entry porch. Most of these features can be seen on the main building as shown in the photo, but are also seen in brick on the ballroom, the carriage house, the caretaker's house, and other structures on the property. The Matheson family ownership is significant due to their local ties to the Fairfax County community and for the modifications that they made to the property and what exists today. Malcolm Matheson Sr. made considerable monetary donations to the nearby St. Luke's Church, and Malcolm Matheson Jr. was involved in the construction and development of notable Fairfax County buildings, including the Mount Vernon Visitor Center and McLean CIA building. The property was listed on the Fairfax County Inventory of Historic Sites in 1969 as Wellington, Washington's River Farm. And that's important due to the name of the property. So when it was authorized as River Farm Historic Overlay District, but it needs to be noted that that's a little bit of a misnomer because it's not the entire River Farm property as existed under George Washington. Therefore, we've modified the name of the Historic Overlay District to Wellington at River Farm Historic Overlay District. David, next slide, please. So here's an overview of the proposed boundary. As you can see, the purple is the same outline of the property that is owned by the American Horticultural Society right now. There are no additional properties being proposed to be included with the Historic Overlay District. So staff determined there are contributing and non-contributing features on the property. To be a contributing feature, it has to be within the period of significance that I mentioned earlier, that 1919 through 1973 era. And has to have a historic integrity from the time that Matheson and his family lived on the property. Therefore, all the buildings in green, excuse me, are considered contributing properties, and those include the manor house, the patio, the kitchen, the ballroom, tenant house and caretakers, and then the north and south garages. One new contributing feature, important contributing feature that we made is the view shed from the manor house looking east towards the Potomac River. The easement on the property that's by the Virginia Outdoors Foundation covers a lot of that area. However, we felt it was important to include an additional view from the eastern portico to the river. Some non-contributing features on the property, those are outlined in the red or orange. Those include the James Monroe White House gates, the ha-ha wall, the orchard, the new driveway, the children's garden, and the meadow. David, if you go ahead to the next slide, please. So here's just some close-up pictures. There's a lot of buildings on the property, so I picked a couple that were important. So here's the Wellington Manor House from the south elevation, possibly dated to 1790, but we couldn't confirm that information by the time we had to start publishing the staff report. It was renovated in the 1920s, and therefore that's a period of significance in which the Matheson family owned it. To the top center there is the Wellington Ballroom, Manor House Ballroom, and to the center right there is the Wellington Carriage House, and then the caretaker's house there is on the bottom. Those are all contributing features on the structures. Next slide, David. A couple more contributing structures and features. The central and western wings of the carriage house on the left side of your screen, the north garage on the south elevation, and then that's what the view shed looks like that we're trying to preserve as a contributing feature on the top right. David, next slide, please. Here's a few examples of the non-contributing features. The White House, the James Monroe White House gates were listed as non-contributing as they were moved from their original location on the driveway, on the old driveway that is now on the neighboring property, so those are now non-contributing. The ha-ha wall, we're not exactly sure, and we're not able to complete enough research to determine when the ha-ha wall was constructed. So it is a non-contributing feature, but it is important to note on the property. And then the new driveway looking eastward toward the manor house and the Potomac River is on the bottom right, and that's another non-contributing feature. Next slide, David. So now moving into kind of the more administrative part of this historic overlay district, the proposed comprehensive plan amendment. The language in the comprehensive plan as it states now, it is a private recreation use, and that's what it's planned for. That will not be changing with this proposal. The comprehensive plan amendment is editorial in nature, and we'll be updating the references to this property, the Wellington at River Farm property, to note that it is now a historic overlay district if it is adopted by the board. Next slide, please, David. I'm going to pass off this slide to Lily Yegazu, who is working on this part of the application. Lily?
Good evening, Lily Gazu, Zoning Administration Division staff. As Laura mentioned, I am the planner who is actually working on the zoning ordinance amendment and the rezoning portion of the proposal to establish the Wellington at River Farm Historic Overlay District, or WHOD. The zoning ordinance amendment portion will create new regulations with emphasis on the protection of existing features of historic significance within the proposed historic overlay district. In evaluating the type of land uses proposed to be permitted within the district, we reviewed the list of uses currently allowed in the R2 underlying zoning district by right, by special exception, or by special permit to determine which uses would be appropriate and not detrimental to the proposed WHOD. Based on this review, we looked at proposing to continue to allow uses that are currently permitted by right in the underlying zoning district, which includes single-family detached dwellings, public uses, and accessory uses. Staff also proposes to allow the Board of Supervisors, with input from the Planning Commission and by approval of a special exception, any special permit or special exception uses permitted in the underlying zoning district currently, but subject to use limitations applicable to those uses. We believe this will allow the board to consider appropriate uses through approval of a special exception with standards that will preserve the existing character and neighboring properties. If the board adopts this proposal, we're looking at implementing the proposed standards in the current zoning ordinance. However, if the ZMOD or the zoning modernization effort currently underway gets approved, staff is also recommending the special exception approval by the board be replaced with the special exception approval for a new use called alternative use of historic buildings in ZMOD. This alternative use of historic building uses would allow the board to approve a special exception to permit any non-residential use within a structure listed on the Fairfax County inventory of historic sites, with the intention to incentivize and preserve the preservation of historically significant sites through the allowance of appropriate adaptive reuse. Similar to the standards that will be proposed in the current zoning ordinance, any non-residential use permitted as an alternative use of historic buildings would also be required to be compatible with the surrounding residential neighborhoods. This will allow uses that are compatible and appropriate for the WHOD, while at the same time making sure the WHOD will continue to be preserved and protected. David, next slide, please. And then the rezoning portion of this application, as mentioned earlier, is part of a series of actions required to establish the boundaries of the Wellington at River Farm Historic Overlay District. Since historic overlay districts are zoning districts, the establishment of the WHOD requires the board to approve a rezoning application to rezone the property into the historic overlay district and amend the zoning map to create the boundaries of the historic overlay district. That is the only change that is proposed as part of the rezoning application. With that, I conclude my presentation and I am available to any questions you may have. And I give it back to Laura.
Thank you, Lily. David, if you go to the next slide, please. So now I'm going to introduce the consultants who put together our draft design guidelines for us. They have a separate presentation, and Sarah, it will be from Sarah Vonish and Laura Hughes from EHT Traceries. Sarah, David has a copy of your PowerPoint if you want him to run it, or you can run it yourself. It's your choice.
Whatever is easier. I'm happy to pull it up though.
Okay, that's fine. Let's go ahead and make you
Okay.
a presenter.
I'm just waiting for it to allow me, so bear with me.
David, you might have to make Sarah present. Oh, there we go. Oh, I'm the presenter. Go. There we go. Hold on. Sorry, everyone. Technical difficulties.
Sorry, bear with me. I can. Oh, there you go.
Okay, here we go. I got it. Thank you. All right. Can you all see my screen? Yes?
Yep.
Okay.
Great. Well, I am just going to introduce the project and just talk a minute about traceries, and then really hand it over to Sarah to talk more in depth about the design guidelines we've been preparing. Next slide, please. We just wanted to give a brief introduction to EHT Traceries. We are historic preservation consultants, a women-owned firm that was established in 1977. So we've been working in Northern Virginia for many, many years. And we've been working on the update for the historic district overlay design guidelines with Fairfax County for the past year and a half. With me and today is Sarah Vonish, who will be doing a large portion of the presentation and is the project manager. And Ben Walker has been helping us doing the documentation and research for the design guidelines. Next slide. This is just the outline and agenda for our presentation. We really just wanted to explain the purpose of the design guidelines and clarify what design guidelines can and cannot do. And then briefly do an overview of the potential Wellington at River Farm Historic Overlay District design guidelines, and then explain how it's intended that the design guidelines will be used. And then we will be available for any questions at the end of the presentation. So I'll turn it over to Sarah now.
Thanks, Laura. So the goals of the project were to create user-friendly and graphically interesting design guidelines to help any future owners or applicants of projects thoughtfully design compatible additions within this historic landscape and with all the historic buildings on the site. They provide historical, hopefully you all had a chance to see, I know they were uploaded with the project materials. They provide an overview of the historic background of the property, as well as the guide to how to apply to the ARB for review for a proposed project. And they're intended to help both the applicants as well as the ARB in their review of projects, so they have a good understanding of what's significant about the property and what the property includes. So then the design guidelines section offers recommendations for design treatment strategies to maintain and enhance the historic and architectural character of Wellington at River Farm. They are only recommendations, they're not requirements, they're not approved by the Board of Supervisors like the zoning overlay. They are approved by the ARB and again are guidance, not recommendation or not requirements. So here's where we are in the process. You can see we've developed the draft, met with GPD staff, and we're here at the community meeting. So there's still time for us to go back and make revisions and edits as needed before presenting to the ARB and then ultimately finalizing the design guidelines. And as Laura mentioned, we've been working with the county on updating the existing design guidelines. There are currently 13 historic overlay districts and a couple other potential historic overlay districts. So we've been working on preparing an overall design guidelines to provide more guidance on how the whole process works and what an HOD means, and then district specific design guidelines, including the potential for Wellington. So what guidelines can and cannot do? Guidelines, I've kind of covered this, but they can aid citizens, property owners, and design professionals to better understand the ARB's review process and the ARB's standards, which are based on the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, which are a set of nationally recognized standards intended to preserve the historic character and materials and features of historic properties, while also allowing their adaptation for new uses and current living requirements. They provide objective criteria for the ARB to use when they are reviewing projects, provide a better understanding of the physical and historic character of the district, assist the evolution of the HOD in a sensitive manner, as I mentioned, and outline a degree of adaptability that's appropriate within the HOD, and that is well aligned with preservation standards. So they can't require that all historic buildings or the historic site remain as they were originally. They also can't always resolve design challenges or specific concerns or specific projects that are proposed. They're general. So they don't give case specific advice, but that's where the ARB comes in. They don't regulate interior design. They don't regulate, they provide recommendations, and they do not improve maintenance of existing properties. And again, as I mentioned, they do not become part of nor an amendment to the county's zoning ordinance. They are a separate item. So what's in the draft design guidelines? We have the chapter 1, which is the introduction, chapter 2, which reviews the history and significance, outlines the character defining features in chapter 3, along with the boundaries and the contributing and non-contributing resources within the HOD. And chapter 4, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, has the meat of the document, and that's the district-specific design guidelines. And the appendix, and this can change as we find more information or need to add more information, but includes a glossary of terms and additional resources for users. So what's in the design guidelines chapter 4 section? It's divided into 3 sections. All the design guidelines are based on the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, as I mentioned, and they include recommended and not recommended actions. The recommended actions being those that are appropriate and help preserve the character of the HOD, and those that are not recommended could have the potential to harm the character or historic materials in the HOD. So the first section discusses the preservation and rehabilitation of existing buildings. It provides guidance for general maintenance issues and strategies for preserving the historic materials. It also outlines a treatment hierarchy that begins with minimally invasive actions such as repair, and then what to do when more invasive actions such as replacement are required and how to go about that. The second section talks about new construction and new additions and how to relate those to the existing buildings and to help applicants design compatible new construction that complements the existing district character. The final section is about landscape, streetscape, and archaeology, which is particularly important here at Wellington for its beautiful landscape and gardens. It identifies important trees and landscape elements to be preserved going forward, provides guidance for natural landscapes, woodlands, design landscapes and gardens, as well as circulation patterns and the relationship between buildings and the buildings to the landscape. It also provides some guidance on how to appropriately approach any archaeological resources within the proposed Wellington at River Farm HOD, which there is likely potential for archaeological resources given its history. And Laura already talked about this, but here you can see the historic built features that are contributing. And so the guidelines really talk about the different materials, historic materials, such as the wood siding, the brick and the stucco on the original main portion, as well as the different types of windows, just so that applicants and users of this document can recognize those character defining features that are found within the district. And on the left, you just see a map of the different building periods that Laura talked about. And here, all the rich landscape features, including the very unique Osage orange tree on the landscape, among others. So how will the design guidelines be used? Again, I already talked about this, but I will reiterate. It's a resource for the ARB property owners, interested neighbors or community members to learn about the history and the significance of Wellington at River Farm, to provide a visual resource to identify character defining features that should be preserved as any future project going forward. Provides the design guidelines for preserving those character defining features and for inserting new construction or new additions within the district in an appropriate manner, as well as those reference images for what's recommended and what's not recommended. So with that, I will turn it back to Laura for questions, I think.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. I have 1 or 2 more slides if David could pull it back up. I've got a little bit on the schedule and then just some more information on how to use WebEx and for the question and answer. Okay, so just schedule and milestones moving forward. November 17th is when this is the HOD was authorized and the motion was made. Tonight we're here with you, the community, presenting our findings, the HOD boundaries, and our draft design guidelines, among other things. Tomorrow, the staff report is going to be published. It'll be on our plan amendment website, as well as the rezoning website and the zoning ordinance amendment website. On March 17th, in 2 short weeks, we'll be going to the Planning Commission for a public hearing, and then our goal is to make it to April 13th for the Board of Supervisors public hearing. I will note that any comments for the public hearings, please send them to myself or Supervisor Stork's staff, as well as the Planning Commission if you'd like to speak at the public hearing, or the the Planning Commission public hearing or the Board of Supervisors public hearing. The design guidelines, as Sarah mentioned, are an open document that will not be finalized until after the HOD is potentially adopted. So those can be modified until that point. So David, if you go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so now we're going to the question and answer session of this. And I have staff on hand, a couple of our staff members, Nicole Brannon, Kira Davis, and Evelyn Mitchell, helping on the side to be able to help us answer your questions. So Evelyn, if you would go ahead, similar to our last community meeting with Holland Hills, would you go ahead and read one of the questions from the Q&A out loud? And we'll kind of try to go through them, and I'll try to respond to them one by one. Also, if you have the opportunity to raise your hand and ask a question, we will unmute you, and you will then have the floor to speak. You have the floor to speak. So Evelyn, if you go ahead and ask the first question.
This first one is for Supervisor Stork. Did AHS explore any options with you that would allow them to stay at River Farm either as a leaser or leasee?
I've had no discussions with River Farms other than with the executive committee, and those conversations have all been about how do we work together to protect River Farm. There doesn't seem to be any interest on their part, based on my conversations, with them remaining at the property. That's at least as of our last conversation, which was probably a month or so ago.
Great, thank you very much. Kira, were there any hands raised that you saw?
There are currently no hands raised.
Okay, we'll just go through the questions. If you could just alert me when some hands are raised. Thank you.
I will.
Okay, the next question states, how many HODs are currently in existence?
Currently, there are 13 historic overlay districts in the county. Some you may be familiar with in the Mount Vernon district. There's Huntley Historic Overlay District, Woodlawn Historic Overlay District, Pohick Church Historic Overlay District, and a couple more in the Mount Vernon Supervisor District. But there's currently 13, and there's 3 in process now, additional ones now, including this one. Holland Hills Historic Overlay District is proposed in the Mount Vernon District, and Holmes Run Acres is in the, I'm going to mess this up, Providence District, but I don't think that's correct.
I think it is Providence.
That's right.
Okay.
It's Providence.
Thank you. All right, next question, Evelyn.
Okay, the next question is, what is the significance of the East Boulevard limited width in terms of potential development?
David, if you could, and I'm going to ask you to slide around slides here, but if you could go back to the slide, one of the 3rd or 4th slides in the PowerPoint, it shows the easements on the property. I think it's slide number, that one. Oops. Slide number 7. Keep going, David. Yep. Slide number 7, I think. That one. Thank you. Okay, so this, and I was remiss in skipping over this information in my PowerPoint, I apologize. So this slide shows the easement, and this is a good question brought up in the chat. So the easement for the George Washington Memorial Parkway extends onto the Wellington property, and it's a viewshed protection easement, and does not allow any subdivision within that easement. Also, the easement, there's an additional easement owned by the Virginia Outdoors Foundation along the Potomac River side of the property. It's about 8 acres, and that also does not allow for subdivision within those boundaries. Let me make sure I answered that question, because I think there was something. Okay, the functionality. I'm trying to see the question here. Evelyn, could you read it to me one more time?
It says, what is the significance of the East Boulevard limited width in terms of potential development?
So if we're talking about the limited width of the street, that is something that would be regulated by use and analysis coming in. For any potential uses that come in, we would look at the transportation impact on that street. And I know it's a very quiet, I'm not sure it even has any street lines on it, but a very quiet street, and that would be analyzed for any new use that would come in. So that wouldn't be looked at this time. Next question, Evelyn.
Okay, this one's more of a statement, but they said, I don't see any conditions in the rezoning amendment to prohibit subdivision of the 27-acre property, i.e. R2.
Right. So, and Lily Yegos, you might be, I'll set it up and see if she has any more additional information to add. So with this proposal, subdivision of the property is still a potential use that's allowed by right. So the by right use is R2, 2 dwelling units per acre. However, the historic overlay district boundary would add additional reviews to any proposal that comes within the boundary. So if there is a proposed subdivision and the historic overlay district is adopted, additional review would be afforded to the Architecture Review Board, but also if it was a special exception use for an institutional use, I'm sorry, institutional would be by right, but a church use or independent living facility, that would all go before the Board of Supervisors. So there is still potential for the property to be divided, to be subdivided. However, there are additional protections in place with the establishment of the historic overlay district.
That is correct. Except other than the area that already has the easement to limit subdivision, subdivision, for example, to allow uses that are permitted by right, such as single-family detached dwelling, may be permitted, provided the additional review, for example, the subdivision plan would be reviewed by the ARB, but any other use that currently requires a discretionary review, like a special permit or a special exception, will need to be reviewed by the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors before it gets approved.
Evelyn, next question, please.
The next question is, how do you enforce the recommendations?
The recommendations. So the recommendations are the design guidelines, and those are used as guiding tools for the Architecture Review Board in which to base their analysis. So as Sarah Vonish presented, if someone came in with a different type of material palette and wanted to put stone, that would not be in conformance with the historic overlay district. And the recommended material uses would be brick or wood siding. However, that's not to say that it's not allowed at all. It's just guiding principles for changes and modifications to be made and put in.
Okay, the next question states, does a HOD designation increase public access to the property, or does it simply limit the new owner's ability to renovate or improve?
The historic overlay district does not change the access to the property. It's still private property. So that would not change the access permissions. That's a private issue for the property owner to determine. And what was the second part of that question, Evelyn?
It said, let me scroll back up. So does an HOD designation increase public access to the property, or does it simply limit the new owner's ability to renovate or improve?
It doesn't limit their ability to improve it. It just notes that they have to have additional provisions to go through and to have additional reviews in place. So the Architectural Review Board would be looking at the application. Those are historic preservation professionals that are appointed by the Board of Supervisors. There's architects, historians, archaeologists, landscape architects, and professionals in the field that would be able to use those guiding principles and the design guidelines to ensure that any modifications on the property would be in conformance with the historic nature and significance.
Okay, the next question is, do you anticipate any objections to this HOD?
That would be great if we didn't. However, at this point, I do not know of any, but that's with my limited outreach on this. I don't know if anyone else wanted to pipe in or has heard anything, but I have not heard at this time of any opposition to the historic overlay district.
Okay, the next question is, does the HOD mean that the owners will not be able to build new houses on the land?
That is not correct. If the application came in and was asked to be subdivided, the subdivision is still possible. It would just have additional regulations and layout that would be reviewed by the Architectural Review Board. A good example would be in the Woodlawn Historic Overlay District. An application came in, and this was a little bit different. It wasn't subdivision, but came in and wanted to build a restaurant within the Woodlawn Historic Overlay District. So what they did was they looked at where the restaurant was sited, how they were impacting the view sheds to and from the historic building, and then what the building was going to look like so it would meet the historic overlay district principles. There's other subdivisions in the county that have done a subdivision and preserved the historic houses on site. This site is very unique in that it has restrictions on either side of the property that would not allow subdivision. However, it does not mean that it is restricted or prohibited. It would just have additional review before going forward.
Next one, guidelines are recommended, not required. Could the property be purchased and developed with no regard for any guidelines?
If the historic overlay district moves forward and is adopted, then it would at the very minimum have Architectural Review Board oversight for the site plan subdivision. That's the short answer. That's the short answer to that question.
The next question, I applaud the speed with which the county has acted on this HOD. Will it be possible to expand the boundaries in the future to protect the view to the areas that do not have easements, or to include the original driveway in the HOD?
That's a good question. In the staff report that's being published tomorrow, you can see the analysis of the inclusion of at least the original driveway for archaeological purposes. However, with the speed of this process, we did not have enough time to complete an archaeological survey, so we would not be able to add that at the current time, just because we do not know what a survey like that would yield. However, it was deemed by our county archaeologists that it has medium to high potential on the property, not just for the driveway, but all through the property. So we're anticipating, as we find out more information in history on this historic overlay district, that the period of significance might be expanded and it would be modified in the future, but we just don't have the information now to be able to include that analysis with the staff report.
The next question, do your guidelines address the grounds and/or habitat? And for historic preservation purposes, what time period are you using?
For historic preservation purposes, the period of significance is the 1919 to 1973. So there's kind of three periods on this property. There's the George Washington period, there's the Matheson period, and then there's when the American Horticultural Society bought it. There's a couple other owners in between Washington and the Mathesons. However, those are kind of three pieces we've looked at. The American Horticultural Society did make some modifications to the property. And as we mentioned in the design guidelines, is that, for example, the orange osage tree is very significant, but that's not any restriction that we can put in the zoning ordinance. So that's why it's included as a recommendation, so that we can still preserve the areas and landscapes and places we feel need to be preserved, but we can't regulate whether or not a tree can go up or down. We would leave that to the Architecture Review Board to take into a consideration of a larger proposal.
Is the resource protection area the same as the Virginia Outdoors Foundation 8 acres?
David, if you could scroll up to the slide above this one. So you can, I don't have a map with the RPA. Oh, I'm sorry, maybe it's the other one. It should be between the two maps. It's slide 6 and 7. Yeah, maybe down. Yeah, there you go. So I don't have a slide with both the RPA and the easement on it. But if you look, the dotted area is the RPA area, and the easement basically extends to between the house, which is a little white rectangle in the middle of the property, and the meadow, and extends to the north. So it's not exactly the same length or area, but the RPA is located within the Virginia Outdoors. Part of it is located within the Virginia Outdoors Foundation easement.
The next question, what is the assessed value?
I do not know the answer to that question. Does anyone on the call know the answer to that question?
Yes, this is Lily. I just looked it up on the county's Department of Tax Administration website, and it's shown as 16,960,000.
16,960,000.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, next question. What specific by right uses would be allowed even with an HOD?
I'm going to defer to Lily on that because I know there's a different definition of things included within the by right uses that are allowed.
Correct. The current zoning district, as mentioned earlier, is R2, residential, 2 dwelling units per acre. And the R2 zoning district does allow by right accessory uses as permitted by our Article 10, affordable dwelling units, dwelling, single family detached, and public uses. These uses are proposed to be also allowed by right once the HOD is established. These are uses that are currently permitted on the property by right, but by right means it doesn't require a special exception or a special permit, but any building permit that will be required for any development, any use that's permitted by right would still need to go through a review by the ARB.
Thank you, Lily.
Okay. Are we ready for another question, Laura?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I think I understood that the entire property is 27 acres, of which 2 areas are not subdividable with Parkway and Club. So what is the potential acreage that can be subdivided?
David, if you could scroll back up to the slide above this one, I believe, with the easements. Thank you. Yeah, so the property is about 27 acres. The National Park Service easement on the west is about 2.2 acres, and the Virginia Outdoors Foundation is about 8 acres. So we have about 18 acres and some change about in the center that could potentially be subdivided that does not have any restrictions on it from the easement. And then what was the second question? I know there was a second part to that question, Evelyn.
So what is the potential acreage that can be subdivided?
Okay, yeah, so it's approximately 18 acres.
Next question, could existing buildings be torn down even with an HOD on property?
Yes, they could be torn down for a number of reasons. However, they would have to get approval and for demolition permit by the Architectural Review Board. There's a number of things that can go into this: maintenance, acts of nature, things like that that would come in. However, they'd have to go before the Architectural Review Board and prove why the building needed to be demolished. And it could be a mitigative effort if something else is being proposed on the property, but this decision would be left up ultimately for the Architecture Review Board to take into account and approve the demolition permit.
Next question. So the owners can build a housing subdivision, or must it stay in Wellington?
I'm sorry, one more time.
It says, so the owners can build a housing subdivision, or must it stay in Wellington?
The owners could build a subdivision because it's zoned by right means, and I saw this question too, by right means that there's no additional planning commission or board of supervisors review that it has to go through. The R2 means that it's looked at and there's a potential and allows for, the underlying zoning allows for 2 dwelling units per acre, and that could happen tomorrow, which is why there was part of the urgency to add this historic overlay district provision on and the legislation that went forward about talking about the Architecture Review Board purview over subdivision. However, someone gonna say something?
Yeah, Laura, it's Barbara. But
Okay,
finish
sure,
what you were
Barbara.
gonna say.
Nope, go ahead. That's fine. I was.
Okay, thank you. So
Mhm.
one thing we haven't, this is Barbara Byron. One thing we haven't talked about tonight is the fact that the easement that runs to the federal government, the National Park Service, has a restriction on access. And so to subdivide anything greater than lots that are smaller than 5 acres, you have to go through what's called county subdivision control. And part of that is that you need frontage on a public street. So we think that the provision of that easement, or actually restriction of that easement, which limits the access to the driveway, will be a significant deterrent to any potential subdivision of the property. It is true that people can subdivide portions of property into lots that are 5 acres or greater that don't go through subdivision control. So that is potentially conceivable on this property. But anything with lots smaller than that have to meet that ordinance and have to have the public street frontage.
Thank you for that clarification, Barbara. Yeah, that's an important factor that limits the development and the subdivision of the property. All right, Evelyn, next question, please.
Okay, next question. Have you taken into account that there might be significant Native American artifacts on the property?
Yes, we have. As I mentioned before, with the speed of this application, there was not time to complete an archaeological survey. I do have our archaeology on board, Ms. Elizabeth Crowell, if you wanted to speak to that piece.
Sure. There was a study that was done on the property in 1987. It was very preliminary in nature. And there were Native American, there was a Native American archaeological site that was identified closer down to the river on a terrace. But the study itself was not comprehensive in any way. It was something that was done with high school students for a couple of weeks in the summer, but they did identify Native American sites, and we have every reason to believe that there's, it looked like from what we could determine from their field notes and such, that the sites were stratified, so in other words, from more than one period, and that there is the potential that there could be more resources there.
Thank you, Liz. I will say, due to the speed, we were not able to do the archaeological survey as we had hoped and would normally be done with a process like this. However, any development within the historic overlay district of any land disturbance would automatically kick in an archaeological review under the Architectural Review Board. So that is something that if there is any land disturbance, we will send it to Ms. Crowell's group for review before any land is modified. All right, Evelyn, next question.
Okay, the next question. East Boulevard is owned by the Interior Department, and they will have a say regarding expanding the entrance to the property. Furthermore, there are only about 14 acres that can be developed. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think it's between 14 and 18. Like I said, I don't know the exact number, but yes, the National Park Service owns that easement and would have a say on any road any access point from East Boulevard Drive to the interior of the property if there was a subdivision.
Okay, the next question. With all easements taken into account, what is the maximum total number of homes that could be built?
So if we're looking at simple math, 14 to 18 acres and you do 2 dwelling units per acre, you're looking at 28 to 36 single family dwellings if they fully developed. That's not to say there's resource protection area on the property that needed to be mitigated as well.
Sorry, give me 1 second. I'm trying to scroll back to the next question. Have you had any interactions with AHS regarding the HOD?
I'm going to defer that question to Supervisor Stork or Nick Reinhardt from Supervisor Stork's staff.
The conversations we've had with the HS board have been more general in nature about the property and the importance of keeping it and protecting it, and that's pretty much it. I know that there's conversations that are being held relative to the proposal that was made by the Regional Park Authority and Northern Virginia Conservation Trust. I'm beyond that. My conversations have all been with them have been general in nature and more broadly protective and ensuring, frankly, the property stays in the public hands in one way or another, either by public ownership or not-for-profit ownership that would be supportive of the public being involved.
I will say too, the American Horticultural Society has let staff on site twice to take pictures, to go inside the property, and has been cooperative in giving us historic information and questions. So I don't think they've come out formally and said whether or not they support the historical overlay district, but they've been providing staff with some background information for our report. Okay,
the next question, are there or were there any considerations to expand the significance of the property beyond the current time period?
As I mentioned previously, we know there's some significance from the ownership from George Washington. However, with the built environment that's on the property today and the limited amount of time we had to complete a research and analysis, we made the decision to base the period of significance at this point on the Matheson family. However, once more information comes to light, that doesn't mean that we can't modify the period of significance based on more information that we find. Just at this point, we felt the strongest evidence that we could move forward on was the Matheson ownership and how they modified the property to its appearance today.
The next question, are there, oh no, is that what I just asked you? Are there or were there considerations to expand?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Are there environmental rules for areas facing the river?
So I'm not an environmental specialist, but I will say there is a resource protection area along the river. And then the Virginia Outdoors Foundation easement has additional protections. But other than that, I can't speak to exactly what they were. If someone's interested in that, I can provide some of the data information and get some more background on that. There's also some information in the staff report regarding some environmental impacts on site.
Okay, next question. How long are the guidelines for development anticipated legally in place, or what is the development timeline?
There's no proposed development for subdivision on this property today as we speak. The whole point of this process is to have preventative measures in place if that ever comes forward. But there is not a development proposal in hand right now.
The next question, can you explain what by right is?
I think I answered that a little bit before, and Lily took that one. Yep.
The next question, does the whole land have to stay together as one property?
Does the whole property have to stay together as one?
Yes, yeah. Does the whole, yeah, that's what the question states.
Once again, this comes up to be a private, it still is private property, and we're looking to put this historic overlay district on top. However, if it's subdivided in the future, that's something that could happen. But once again, that's not on the proposal right now. Are there any other, so Evelyn, sorry, are there any other questions? I see some question marks in the chat. I don't know if people are using that instead of hand raise. Kira.
I can't tell because it's everyone in this section, but when you go to the attendee list, there are no question marks.
Okay. If you want to raise your hand, once again, it's in the bottom bottom right-hand corner. Kathy Schenkel looks like she would like to speak, and we're happy to let you speak. David, can we go ahead and unmute? Let's see if I can do it. I don't know if I can.
Hello. Hi. I was a historian at Arlington National Cemetery for 8 years, and George Washington Park Custis built that house, remember Arlington House, as a memorial to George Washington. And then the area between Mount Vernon and here was part of the 5 farms of George Washington. And the whole point of the review for history is meant to include George Washington's time. It's his land. And this is the last remaining part that has not been divided into Wellington or other neighborhoods. So that would, I guess they tried to sell it to Mount Vernon since it was part of Mount Vernon Estate. So it seems kind of strange to be talking about the 20th century when the 17th and 18th century is the most important. And now that we know about the Native American period, that should be preserved also. It seems like this should be a national preservation site and not have houses put on top of it.
Thank you for your comments. There was a determination made and information when we were collecting and fact-finding on this mission. We started out with some information that the house might have dated back to 1790, but we could not confirm that piece.
Yes, you can confirm it. Ask all the, look at our Wellington handbook.
As of the time we decided to publish the staff report, that piece of information could not be confirmed. We know that it was part of George Washington's farm, and we're not saying that we can't expand on that history. However,
do you know who Tobias Lear is?
I do, his personal secretary, I understand that. However, the built environment that is out there today was heavily modified by the Matheson family and does not show what was on the property physically when George Washington was there. Now, I do take your point about the archaeology information that we think would lend us a hand of outbuildings and other information that may be on site. However, we were not able to do that survey before.
Why not do it now?
I think the goal of the effort was to protect the property from being subdivided. I have recommended that we do an archaeological survey as part of staff's recommendation and final recommendations and put it on top of the priority list that it needs to be done immediately. But in order to get that done, I don't even think a cultural resource management survey could do it from the point it was authorized in November that quickly and turn it around and provide a cohesive study on what was there on site. So
the Mathes's family wanted to sell it to Mount Vernon, along with their property that was adjacent to Mount Vernon down near Mount Vernon itself. And Mount Vernon at the time could not afford to buy it. I think we should leave it intact to give Mount Vernon a chance to buy it later.
Understood, thank you. We do have the information, we do note it in our report. I would urge you to read the report when it comes out tomorrow, and I'm happy to follow up with you specifically on this matter.
It seems like we're doing a lot of work to like pat everybody on the head and say we're going to do what we want instead of listening to the history. You can't bring it back once you get rid of it.
Understood. We are coordinating with the History Commission and the Architecture Review Board on this as well.
So is there like a block of space you could put around and say, like, this 10-acre parcel shall never be changed?
Well, I'm not going to go into that much further because I think we have some other questions too, and I'm happy to follow up with you once again. But I think at this point, the goal was to preserve the property intact with the 27 acres and to preserve it from the subdivision. And we're still kind of setting that all out. But once again, there's no proposal in right now, and any proposal, if the HOD is adopted, would have to have additional regulations by the Architecture Review Board and possibly the Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors. So there are additional.
Is there another kind, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is there another kind of zoning that would make sure nobody could mess it up?
That would involve rezoning the property, and that's not what we're proposing with this application.
Hey, Kathy. Kathy, this is Dan. You're welcome to talk to Nick Reinhardt. He's got a lot more information on this and kind of why we went this direction. Our options are fairly limited to protect the property. We're all concerned about protecting the property, but we can only work within the laws that we have. So we will continue to do everything we can to protect the property, but we do have limitations on that. And in Virginia, there's property rights that we also have to respect. So you're welcome to talk to Nick, and he can kind of fill you in on some of the background and details of what we've been doing.
So I think we should remember the sentence, what would George Washington do?
This is the best we can do at this point in time, okay?
The point in time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
We have a hand raised from Greg Kreider.
David, if you could unmute him, please. Mr. Kreider, you're unmuted. Go ahead. Hello, Mr. Kreider, if you can speak, or go ahead and type a question and we can come back to you.
I have, this is Evelyn. I have one of his questions in the chat. I can read that if he's unable to speak.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
It says, on the map, houses are built in the Parkway easement. So couldn't homes be built along East Boulevard within the HOD?
I don't know the history of when those properties went in specifically and when the easement was put on. I do know that the easement, as it relates to the Wellington at River Farm property, does not allow subdivision at this point. So that would not be permitted within the easement on the property.
Should I go ahead and read another question, or is there?
Sure. I don't know. I'm not sure. It says question.
I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Evelyn.
Okay. The next question, let me scroll. Could a developer get a waiver from the Department of Interior of the street access requirement?
If a development came in, that would be something that would have to be negotiated between the developer and the National Park Service. I can't speak specifically to if they would allow it or not, but that is a deed restriction that's involved with that easement.
Okay, the next question. As Arlington Cemeteries just suggested, could not River Farm be designated of significant interest without having to consider the buildings, i.e. based on the land itself?
I'm sorry, one more time. I'm trying to find the answer.
That's okay. It's towards the bottom. It was at 7:45 p.m. by
Okay,
date.
great. Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
It helps me to have them. So, okay. Designated of significant interest without having to consider the buildings, i.e. based on the land. So I'm not sure kind of what you mean designated by significant interest. For the county, the kind of tools that we have are the inventory of historic sites, which the property is already listed on. And it's an honorific designation and does not protect it from any subdivision or demolition. I will say the historical relay district is the next kind of step up from that. It designates it as historic and also provides some protection. But to be designated of significant interest without having to consider the buildings, I think that the Matheson part is a very significant part of the history of the property. And I think we would be remiss if we only focused on one part without focusing on George Washington, the entire property. I will say in the staff report, there's a much longer history, and in the design guidelines, there's a very thorough history as well that outline all of those sections. So we're leaving the potential to be open once we get more information on that to be able to expand that period of significance.
Okay, the next question.
Oh, sorry. We have another hand raised from Paul Hertel.
Thank you for the presentation and the work you're doing. I appreciate it very much, and certainly appreciate the conundrum everyone and the predicament everyone faces here, wanting to preserve this property while at the same time being constrained what can and cannot be done. One of the things that I'm concerned about here is the easements that are on the property, because from personal experience, both dealing with the Parkway and dealing with scenic easements, it has recently been demonstrated to be relatively easy to get out of them. And so therefore, I would urge that that consideration be taken into consideration as well, to make sure that to make contingency for if those easements disappear, what will happen to the property. Because that, my experiences from Old Town Alexandria, having been the president of Old Town Civic, it was fairly easy for people to get out of easements, and also dealing with the Park Service, which was very amenable to changes on easements as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. The easements are in the deed, do run with the deed and run with the land. But you are correct in that at some point they could possibly be vacated, but that's not proposed at this time. Were there any other questions on items that we have not talked about? I will say that if we do not get to you tonight and you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A. We will be kind of responding to those questions and trying to put kind of a heads up response to those online at some point. Once again, the staff report is going to be published tomorrow. So I think that most of those comments will be going forth to the Planning Commission and to the Board of Supervisors to take those into account during their review of the proposed historic overlay district. Were there any more hands up or questions? Okay, let's do a few more questions. I'm happy, we have the meeting till 8:30, so I'm happy to stay there. Just wanted to make sure if people had questions or needed to leave, just please type them in the Q&A and we will make sure we get to them.
I have a new question, Laura, that came up. As a general matter, is there an incentive with the district or the county to increase the number of HODs? I understood there are currently 13. What has been the rate of designating HODs?
The last historic overlay district was Lake Anne and Reston, I think in the 80s. And there were a couple more, Drainsville Tavern, but there haven't been any new historic overlay districts established since that time. There was a couple that have tried. There was one in the Colchester area that just wasn't able to go through. There have been 2 expansions. There was an expansion to the Centerville Historic Overlay District and the Langley Fork Historic Overlay District in McLean. But the new historic overlay districts, there haven't been any in about 40 years, and we've had 3 new ones proposed in the last 3 years. It's a new day for new historic overlay districts in the county.
There are 2 people that are trying to raise their hand but can't. The first one is David McNally. And then, let's see, Lang Bailey.
Am I on? This is David McNally.
Yes, Mr. McNally, we can hear you.
I'm the one who asked the question earlier about the Interior Department getting a waiver of what I call the street access requirement, since if that's legally doable and as a practical matter feasible, that might get around the developer's requirement, you know, with an under 5 acre lot. When I asked the other question about the period of significance, you were emphasizing the Matheson period, which, as I understood, it started around World War I. And my question was really just the simple fact that River Farm was part of George Washington's estate. Does not that alone not taking into consideration any structures on the property, but just the fact that this property was part of his holdings, isn't that worth including as being significant?
It's not that it's not significant in its own right. It's just in the analysis to move forward, we decided that the Matheson had the majority of the built environment on the property. As I mentioned before, we need an archaeological study done on the site. There's a large amount of, we probably need a cultural landscape study done on the site as well. We just don't have that information at the time to pin the historic overlay district significance based on George, you know, on that piece, other than we know he owned the land.
Well, that was my question. I thought that just the fact that he owned the land would be sufficient. You didn't have to research or document anything further than that. Yeah.
Understood. However, the Matheson period too in its own right is significant, and we would be remiss if we did not kind of preserve the colonial revival architecture that's there and significant. Once again, if we're looking at the built environment of this and what we can see out there and is tangible today, that's the Matheson period, and that's the period of significance we've determined to move forward with. Not to say we can't expand it in the future.
Right.
It's just at this point, the built environment and the evidence that we have today can be significantly tied to the Matheson period.
Okay. Can I tack on one quick follow-up question, which probably is for Supervisor Stork? I understood that there was $2 million in the upcoming state Commonwealth budget dedicated to River Farm. But the question is, what are the funding options and prognosis for being able to buy the property, hopefully in its entirety, to keep for public purposes?
That remains very challenging. The biggest single option outside of private donations and frankly looking for wealthy individuals or group to come and offer support or financing to purchase a property. It's frankly, the county is the only other deep pockets that's available, and the county at this point, given the COVID challenges that we're having with our budget, et cetera, it's very problematic. So it's not, I clearly have had those discussions many times with colleagues and others, but we recognize that it will probably be, as Paul Gilbert with the Regional Park Authority says, we're basically making rock soup here. We're putting together funding from lots of sources in order to try to make it appealing and opportunistic enough for the AHS board to hopefully do the right thing and protect the property while still, getting sufficient income for themselves for the purchase, for selling the property. So we have some major challenges. I don't want to present it any other way to anybody. That absolutely the work that our state delegates and senators did was huge. It makes a big difference. And some money this year, and maybe the next round they can do some additional money, and maybe we put that together with the private funding that I know that is being raised. And I know for myself, I've donated money to do this because I care deeply about it, and ultimately see how and what else we may need, and then maybe the county can make the difference. But it's a lot of work by a lot of people to make sure that this property is protected in perpetuity, and ultimately it is absolutely the American Horticultural Society board that has every ability to do what I consider the right thing, which is to ensure that this property is protected. But I also understand their interest in their fiduciary responsibility to doing what's right for their board, while still doing what I believe is their most important mission, and the mission that HS has had for decades, which is to protect public properties just like that, which is why they acquired the property 50 years ago. Long answer, lots of challenges.
Well, thank you. That's what kind of threw me, because I had earlier understood that AHS was going to merge with the other larger organization, and the proceeds from selling River Farm would be, in effect, its dowry, but that merger was now off. And so I was puzzled why, if the AHS is basically going to go out of business, why they'd need all the money.
HS has made clear that they're not going out of business. They're redirecting their organization. In my many conversations with at least the executive committee, and I know many individuals on this call are also, I'm sure, very involved and very connected with HS and have some other insight to it. But at this point in time, what they've represented to all of us is that they are pulling away from having specific land holdings in a specific area, and would in turn take those funds and provide a national mission, a national program, which is how they are viewing their role at this point in time.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that Ms. Lange Bailey had her hand raised or couldn't raise her hand, so if we could unmute her.
Her and Catherine Tobin, they mentioned that they can't get their hands raised.
Okay, great. Let's unmute Ms. Bailey, and then we can...
It's left. That's quite a minute.
Laura, you're muted.
Thank you, thank you. If you could, Miss Bailey, if you could either turn down your phone or your computer. Sometimes when you're signed in twice, you get the feedback between the two devices. So if I think we're still having some feedback on that. If maybe you let's try to unmute her one more time, David, and then we'll move on to Ms. Tobin and then come back to Ms. Bailey. Ms. Bailey, if you're there.
I'm here.
Still having some really bad feedback. Let's go back to Ms. Tobin and then Ms. Bailey. We'll try to come back to you in just a minute. David, could you please unmute Catherine Tobin, please?
Hello, Laura.
Hi, Ms.
Hello,
Tobin.
everyone.
How are you?
Thank you very much. I heard your prior discussion a few weeks ago with the Wellington Association, and thank you for what you presented then and this evening. And I'm going to be frank with you and with the supervisor. If I were a interested party wanting a beautiful piece of land, I would not find this tough to get around. As several of the recent speakers said, it is easy to get around easements. And as another speaker recently said, the simple fact is there is historical common sense information here that seems to all of us to be the argument. We have to do better than this. This is too important. We've got to rely on the archaeological, and I know you have hopes to do that, but as you've also said, time is of the essence. It cannot get more valuable than the historic Native American beginnings and George Washington. And people can scoot around. I know a lot about the law. I'm a donor to Supervisor Stork in terms of the fiduciary responsibilities of the board. If you look at, and I hope some of you have, if you looked at their annual reportings for their income tax, it is not a big budget. And that which is being proposed by the public with this magnificent support of the state can help address that. I think there's just still a lot of something else going on there, and I won't even put words to it, but the fiduciary responsibility is not an excuse. The COVID-19 situation is not an excuse. And members being able to have access, we shouldn't be thanking them for having access to the land. For those of us who are members and the like, I'm very happy there's earnest effort, but earnest effort, I think we've got to get a lot tougher here. And as two other speakers said, the Matheson story, and I understand it because I have a doctorate myself. There's data, but there's also, look at the assumptions. There's data and there's also basic common sense. And I think we've got to argue from that common sense viewpoint in order for this to have any teeth. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for your comments. Ms. Bailey, I think we were going to ask you questions through Ms. Schenkel if that was appropriate. Ms. Bailey, are you there?
I'm trying. Hello?
You sound very far. I'm still having trouble hearing you, Ms. Bailey.
Can we please get in and come back or how do you go? I sit on my computer.
I'm sorry, I'm still having trouble understanding you. It sounds like you're very far away. I'm still having a little bit of trouble.
It looks like in the chat, maybe her question had to do with archaeological, the archaeological work we've talked about. Maybe we can just confirm that.
Oh, I see, the archaeological question with Mount Vernon Estate. Yeah, in the presentations with the Wellington Civic Association and the Mount Vernon Council of Civic Associations, that was brought up as well. That's something we can possibly look into. We just haven't explored that opportunity yet. Were there any other questions or hands raised, Kira? And if you, once again, if you can't type in, or I'm sorry, if you can't raise your hand, if you just type in to the question and answer to raise your hand, we'll get to you at that point too.
I have there's one statement slash question I can read. There are conservation tax credits the AHS could take by putting the property in conservation. They could get around 4 to 8 million, then sell the property to the Regional Park Authority for around 8 or 9 million. Then they'd have what it's worth. Is that right?
I can't comment on that. I'm not a conservation expert. I do know that conservation easements have to be requested by the property owner. It's not something we can place on top of them. So they would have to agree to go under conservation easement. I can't speak to what it would cost or the park authority purchasing it.
The last question that's in the chat is, has a land swap been explored?
Not at this time. There would have to be opportunity presented for that. And I believe there has to be some sort of development proposed, but we don't have any of that as of this time.
And Laura, if I could just add in general, none of us have any illusions about the degree of difficulty because the HS board owns the property and nobody else owns the property. It's their right to do, frankly, as they wish within the law. And all we've done with this, frankly, is to do what we have the ability to do without specific permission from them or, if you will, even their support. And those things can at least help us potentially manage some of what they or a subsequent property owner might want to do. But this is truly about what the AHS board wants to do and how they want to protect this property. And I understand, their perspective is going to be, their perspective. Our job is to try to find a way for them to do, in my mind, the right thing and protect this property for future generations. Our job is to provide as many incentives or things that we can do that hopefully enables them to make what I think is the right choice. But they have rights that we can't usurp. And while there may be things that limit them or make it more difficult for them or some other property owner, in the end, they can pursue what they believe they need to pursue. So it's very critical in my mind that we do everything we can, like this historic overlay district, like the legislation that Scott Srovell was instrumental in getting started at the Senate and ultimately the House passed, Paul Cusack and others, David Bulova, Mark Sickles. But those are pieces that give us some ability to potentially either limit or manage, if you will, what a subsequent either HS or subsequent property owner might want to do. So those are our challenges, and I can be angry about it, I can be unhappy about it, but most importantly, I need to get to work like all of us have been doing to try to see what things we legally can do to make sure that my kids and our kids' kids can have the same opportunity to enjoy that property as I've had. Thank you.
Laura, it's Barbara. Could you also expand upon what the supervisor just said? There's been a lot of discussion tonight about the reason that the qualifying structures of the period that we're using to put in the HOD, but isn't it true that the fact is that it's most important to get it in an HOD, not as important as exactly why it got put in one?
I would say to that point that yes, we want to have the HOD is the tool that we could use to best protect the property from the county perspective that we could put on there. However, I will say too, we're not discounting the fact that George Washington owned the property and that, and to the other degree, that the American Horticultural Society owned the property as well. It's just at this point, with the information that we have and doing very preliminary amount of research. I do not pretend I'm an expert on this in any way, shape, or form of the property, but we had to move forward and develop some parameters, and we went with the period of significance for the Matheson property. It's not that it's not significant, it's just that with this application and the proposal as it stands today, this is the information that we have and we look forward to. And I will say too, this is expanded much, much more in the staff report and the histories in there, leaving the opportunity for it to be modified. But as we've said a number of times tonight, the goal is to get protection for the property. And with the adoption of this historic overlay district, that would do that. It would give additional protection and methods for us to move forward. So if there's no other questions, like I said, if you have any questions, please put them. Oh, I think David McNally has one more question at 8:16. But if you would like to, if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to me. This PowerPoint will be uploaded to the Holland Hills Project website. And my contact information is on there, as well as Supervisor Stork's Land Use Aide, Mr. Nick Reinhardt, and we'll feel free to contact either one of us, and we'll direct you to the right person and get you some answers for your question. If we could see, I think Mr. McNally had one more question. At the end, if we could.
Am I on?
Yep, sir, go ahead.
Okay, it was just kind of amplifying my question I asked earlier about the Interior Department and sort of street access. I live right across from the Horticultural Society River Farm property. I'm on West Boulevard Drive, and technically 12 or 15 feet of my front yard and everybody else's up and down West Boulevard belongs to the Park Service. And technically, I think historically, nobody was supposed to have street access, a driveway. But everybody does. And my house was built in 1937, and it might have been grandfathered in, but there are at least 2 new houses on the same block that are, built in the last couple of years that got them. So the point being that nobody should rely on the Interior Department, even of the new administration, to deny a request for street access if that property, River Farm, is developed into 28 to 36 houses.
Thank you for that comment. I think that's just one point we were trying to mention as an additional factor that needed to be taken into account by the developer. It's not the only factor. That's why we're requesting and proposing the historic overlay district, but it is another deterrent.
Mm-hmm. And there's no thought, I guess, of trying to tie this in with, I grew up in DC and family friends were involved in establishing the National Colonial Farm, the Moyone Reserve across from Mount Vernon, down in that area on the Maryland side. Has there been any thought of kind of tying in with the Park Service as part of the National Colonial Farm, although that would involve more development that perhaps we would like to see?
As of this point, I don't think so. Once again, it is private property. So it would have to go through the normal channels to be, purchased by the National Park Service, and we don't have any information on a proposal like that at this time.
Okay,
To
sure.
speak to that broadly, the meetings that we've held, and we've held a number of them that I organized and got in folks at the federal, state, regional, local levels, and the National Park Service, the George Washington Memorial Parkway folks have been involved, and they're interested, but their response is it would take literally an act of Congress. So that's not something that would be urgent, particularly timely. And I'm confident they would be very open to that, but again, somebody ultimately would need to acquire the property.
Sure. Right.
Laura, it's Barbara again. I think there was one more question, and that people were curious as to how they might get a download of this recording.
You're muted again, Laura.
Muted.
I cannot go. You have to do at least one time when you're muted and trying to speak during each meeting. I think I'm on 2 now, so I've reached my limit. But yes, this meeting will be uploaded to the project website listed at the bottom there, and it will be under community outreach, and it will be posted. I think it takes about a week to go up, so will be posted by, today's the 2nd, by March 9th, and we will post a transcript as well, and we will work on responding to the questions in the Q&A that were not answered during tonight's presentation. So with that, Supervisor Stork, have you had any last words, last comments or words you'd like to say, and then we will go ahead and close the meeting.
Well, Laura, you and your team have done an amazing job, and I know Barbara Byron and so many others that are here have really made major contributions to getting us where we are today. I don't think people appreciate how quickly this has been done, and I think we all recognize that it's not. It doesn't give us protection. It helps to maybe provide a means for reducing some of the risks, but it doesn't eliminate them. And I assure everybody here, I am deeply determined, and we have spent hundreds of hours so far trying everything to make sure that we protect this gorgeous historic property. So we will continue working on that. Please feel free to engage us at any time and any place. Nick Reinhardt is staff aide who's in the middle and working hard with the rest of the county staff. We will continue working on this until we get the HOD approved. I'm confident that we'll get the board to support that. And then we have additional steps which the state legislature has passed, and I'm confident we'll soon have on our desk to move forward with as well. That will give us a little bit more protection. But in the end, please engage the AHS board and board members. They're a national organization. If you know people around the country, share our situation with them, because they in turn can share that with their local representatives and as well as local folks who may know board members, so they can understand that this truly is a national issue. This property is truly a national asset that needs to be protected. So again, thank you very much for spending the time tonight, and I'm sure we will be talking further about this.
Thank you very much. Once again, the best place for the information is either to contact myself, Supervisor Stork's office with Nick Reinhardt, or on the plan amendment website that David's about to pull up right now. If you go to the county website and type in search River Farm in the search bar, it'll come up, or River Farm or Wellington, and it will come up, and you'll be able to find it that way. Once again, if you need any information, please don't hesitate to contact my office or Supervisor Stork's office. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Nick. Have a good night.
You too.
Hey, Laura.
Yes,
I'm gonna make you the host so you can download everything. Does that sound?
yes, that'd be fine.
Sorry, the
Thank you.
PowerPoint froze up. I don't know what happened.
It's okay. It's okay. We were done. We're all done. Thank you.
It's sure. Okay, you're now the host.
Great. Thank you. Hopefully it'll let me,
All right, this is Evelyn. Do you need me to do anything before I hop off?
I'm trying to see if I can download. Let me stop recording. There we go.